Hello, and welcome back to another wonderful episode of the War Report. Now, we have quite the news, so we're a little bit late this week, some scheduling conflicts, but regardless, let's get right into it. We have some Syria news, starting with what is this, the fourth death of Al-BaghDEADi?
I think it's the fourth. I could be wrong. If not, the third.
Yeah, July 2017. There were a couple in 2018, and I think this is number four. Now, as the official story tells us, Al-Baghdadi was found on a border town between Syria and Turkey in Idlib. Keep in mind, this is the leader of ISIS in Idlib province at least. And they said the raid went. They killed some of his lieutenants, some of his bodyguards, his wives, and then eventually they had him cornered like in the caves, and he committed suicide via a grenade or suicide vest. I've heard both with his three children, and they've identified the
Those
remains.
guys never take off those suicide vests. Am I right?
Yeah. It's like in the movies. It's like in the movies, like where they're just always wearing them. You figured that would just be like an
They
easy
just never
target, just
take them
like
off.
bam.
It's totally believable.
Oh, absolutely. It's like uh, it's like we haven't escaped post 9/11 like entertainment involving contemporary politics.
Yeah.
It's like you were watching like one of those crime shows from like 2005, and it's like, oh, this guy who looks exactly like Bin Laden. He's not Bin Laden though. He's wearing the C4, and don't watch out. But um, that's aside the
What
point.
is that? Is that anthrax?
Let me taste that. Yeah, anthrax. But um,
Yeah, that's definitely anthrax. Really
apparently,
high grade, man.
yeah. Apparently, they were able to identify his charred remains and confirm that was al-Baghdadi. And in a very familiar story, guess what happened to his body? It was buried at sea. We've never seen that one before, have we? Now, in terms of do I actually believe the story or not? Yes, you heard me right. He was, of course, buried at sea. Now, that's a familiar story. I can't remember quite where I heard that one before. Major terrorist leader killed in a very obscure place that you wouldn't figure he would have been in, and his remains are mysteriously disposed of in an uncommon way, at least in Islamic tradition. Now, do you remember that guy's name? I can't think of it for the life of me.
Um, I think it was Barack something. I can't remember.
Yeah, like
Barack Hussein? No, it was Obama. Hussein Obama? No.
I think his name was like
Oh, it's Osama. Osama. Hussein Osama. I can't remember.
yeah, it was like
He was a bad dude.
yeah, Osama Ben something. Who knows?
Yeah.
It'll
Oh,
remain a
yeah.
mystery. Now, I have to say, when I initially heard the story, with the concurrence of al-Baghdadi being in Idlib, with the story about how he died, with the fact that apparently Russia and Turkey didn't know he was there, I was inclined to believe it initially, until they mysteriously disposed of his remains in the same way they exposed them in that same other mystery figure we can't think of. But I thought, another theory that floated around in my mind was, okay, maybe Russia and Turkey knew they gave it to the U.S. so we could have our PR victory and get out of there. But now I'm starting to question things, especially considering the fact this is his fourth reported death.
Right. And we shouldn't forget that Osama bin Laden was reportedly, dead and so on prior to Obama. I mean, I don't believe either of the stories. I'm not saying I know the truth. I just don't believe them. I just outright don't. Um, what I do think, though, is, um, of course, there's very, there's some pushback from the media as we would expect, but it's not in that kind of unrestrained way that they usually do with Trump. Um, I think the election coming up is definitely one of them, but I think far more importantly is that Trump pulled the troops. Well, he went back in, but initially he pulled the troops out of the Kurdish held region of northern Syria. So I think he was looking for an optics victory. Uh, why are we supposed to believe that um, igniting Islamist furor over, let's say, dumping his body is like more or less objectionable to them than burying him somewhere. Like, I understand the reason not to bury him. I get it. I mean, all these things can be done in secret, of course. I get the logic behind it, but honestly, like, it's just it's just so bizarre. Like, did they bury Hussein or Gaddafi? Does Baghdadi have a following? Remotely anything like Osama bin Laden's? Like, there's just something fishy about it. Something that's uh, suspicious. But in my opinion, I mean, the way it looked like Trump thanked Russia, and it looked like it was as if Russia might have known where he was, or it was something more than just letting open the airspace. So again, there was this idea that this cooperation between the two countries, which is sometimes true. And so I think it's an optics victory. And the truth is, if the Russians knew where he was, they'd kill him by now. The Russians have killed many, many of their leaders, including one Israeli and one American intelligence officers near the beginning of Russia's entry into the war. Also, there were like 6 or 7 Saudis, but these are all advisors. So I don't think Russia knew where he was, to be honest. But Trump's language is not always clear, and people can kind of think maybe they can interject their own idea of what happened. That maybe it was something more than just opening up airspace, but I don't believe it. I don't think like all of this is it's just a stunt.
Yeah, and especially with him being in Idlib, where you figured he'd be public enemy number one. Not to mention the Kurdish shells still in Afrin, the Turkish-backed groups, the original remnants of the FSA, who, albeit, are not fans of ISIS. You figured he would have been public enemy number one, and especially being so close to the Turkish border. Now, I know Turkey has ties to ISIS, especially the whole oil controversy, but they cut them loose after 2016, about the time everyone else cut them loose, so it's a bit odd. Another theory I have is possibly Turkish intelligence knew and gave the United States the optical victory, so Trump would have the political capital to try to get a withdrawal. I don't know. It strikes me as odd all around.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure what's going on. I just think it was an optics thing after pulling out, because he got a lot of flack for that. It's a story that seems to be happening over and over again, that the U.S. and, for that matter, the European nations, the EU, what have you, are losing ground. They are not coordinating very well, and so on, and that's allowing a vacuum for Russia to squeeze in. But yeah. Anyways, strange event. And again, I've literally heard this story several times, like back in 2007, 2008. Like, it's just, who cares anymore?
Yeah, I'm on the same page as you now. Speaking of giving the U.S. the optical victory to withdraw, of course, we put even more troops in the Omar oil fields, which prompted a bit of a funny comment, albeit from Assad, in an interview with NBC News. Now, he said, in regard to Trump, he's the best American president, not because of his policies, but because he's the most transparent president.
Mm, yeah. That says quite a lot. In a way, I guess what Assad is doing is saying he can't hide his hand the way Osama or Bush did. Oh, sorry, Obama. I really don't mean to do that. Uh, the way Obama and Bush did. I mean, honestly, I don't know who was speaking for Bush, but the truth is, yeah, he's saying they're basically trans. You know, he can figure out what their motives are and so on.
Yeah, and it was funny because, of course, this came from the Hill, and the way they painted it was, oh, Trump gets praise from Bashar al-Assad, and then, of course, the comments are the usual suspects saying, oh, that's another dictator Trump can befriend, or whatever, just the usual boomer liberal sort of thing that you see under these kind of posts when it's funny because it was actually the
Yeah,
exact opposite. So it was the definition of a backhand compliment. But I think his comments beyond that are very telling in terms of even I think if a pro-establishment or at least more pro-establishment person were in office at this point, I go back to this all the time. I think the U.S. has lost so much political capital on the world stage that they couldn't hide their hand. I think any president would be forced to admit that, yes, we're occupying these oil fields just so Syria can't have them, not to prevent the resurgence of ISIS, not to protect the Kurds. No, we're here to protect the oil fields. I think at this point, almost any politician who would be in the office of the president would be forced to admit it.
yeah. The mask has come off, and it's everywhere. I mean, I think you saw the photo of the girls at the NSA celebrating Halloween. It's literally like 18 people, two guys, um, not the most masculine looking guys. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And the rest of these young women, like, and I think people already suspected that this shift had happened. I mean, we were joking in 2017 and 18 about, you know, fighting for gay parades worldwide, and it like, well, I mean, you can see it now, and yeah, and so there's a kind of real politique taking place. Yeah, we're actually, you know what, we're taking the oil just because we're not. This got nothing to do with this. ISIS isn't even there.
Yeah, it's not even we're taking the oil. It's that we don't need this oil, but we don't want you to have it.
Yeah, yeah, it's really pathetic. In a way, they recognize that they actually don't have any political capital anymore, anyways, right? So the only thing that's left is brute force. And it's not a situation that like it won't destroy Syria. It's more of just America being obstinate,
Yeah, but it's going to
and
make it a
it's not
headache whether
going.
that oil is coming from Iran or Russia or wherever because Russia's going to have to get it. Now, granted, the travel from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean is a much safer journey than Iran shipping oil, as we've seen, which there hasn't been really a crisis involving the Persian Gulf in a couple months now, but the point being is it could very easily flare up again.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah,
that Syrian news, it's funny because actually, a couple days before Trump said, "Oh yeah, we're just gonna stay here at these oil fields," he was talking about handing them over to the SDF, who we know, of course, have been very cooperative with Assad, despite recent comments they were saying, "Oh, no deal with the Syrian government. We don't want these Syrian troops to rally around and protect us from the Turks," and just the regular back and forth we've seen for the past 2 years between those groups. But ultimately, I didn't really see that we needed to dedicate much time to that. But moving on from that, more political impotence in the form of Brexit this time. So of course, good old, good old Great Britain, the UK, the United Kingdom, call them what you will, did not get out of the European Union on October 31st. They are still in the European Union, and they are set to have an election on December 12th. Now, of course, uh, this will tie into some of what Macron said and did over the past couple of days, which we'll get into. But we're looking at another general election in the UK, just 2.5 years after the last one. The last one was in June 2017. And so far,
sorry, you.
yeah, so again, an election on December 12th.
I think this may seal it. I think we're looking at the end of Brexit. Um, it was a delay tactic, and it's worked for over a year and a half. It's been 3 years now, 3.5 years since the vote, and I mean it won't repair the EU. The EU has never been weaker. Faith in it has never diminished more than it has. So on that end, the EU has delegitimized itself. And frankly, even if Britain had gotten Brexit through, and maybe there's still a small chance, the elite that's in power is still going to everything that most of the Brexiters hated about being in the EU, and being frankly under their government, which mass migration, global homo, and like all of those things are going to still persist, like whether they're in the EU or not. But I do respect the idea that if Brexit had happened by now, that might have, and it would have, emboldened and changed the course that basically the West has been on for especially the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. And in terms of a general election happening, of course, there were disputes whether Labor won it on the 9th of December and Conservatives won on the 12th of December, of course. When you can get on a weekday versus a weekend affects voter turnout, which, of course, affects other things. Now, the most recent polling as of October 29th and 30th, and these numbers are compared to the 17th and 18th polling period. Uh, the Conservatives are at 40%, up 4% from the 17th, 18th. Labor's at 29, up 2. The Liberal Democrats are at 14, down 3. Brexit Party's at 9, down 2. Now, granted, the Brexit Party said that they wouldn't be running in all constituencies and only running in constituencies where they had a chance of actually winning. And the Greens are at 3 with no visible change. But this election coming up, you look at it here. Now, I know the Conservatives aren't necessarily like the most pro-Brexit party there is, but they're just 1 point short of being able to actually form a coalition government with the Brexit Party if the elections were held with these poll numbers panning out. So, how this election will play out, I don't know. Just by gut instinct, I think it'll be a bad day for the Conservatives just because they've been so impotent on this entire issue. Not only just the Brexit issue, but among other things, among governing the UK. Nothing has really changed since Theresa May has left office. Nothing's really changed since David Cameron left office. So the way it stands now is they would go into a hung parliament, which would probably push an election into January of next year. Now, I think the most logical conclusion you can draw from this is you'll probably get a minority conservative government with other smaller parties, whether that be the Brexit Party or the DUP or what's left of UKIP. But we'll definitely have to see, and I think it's also interesting the time of year they picked it so close to Christmas, less than 2 weeks out from it. So again, we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I remain hopeful, but it's hard to. Um, I'm amazed at how well all of this, for the other side, ostensibly has worked out. The pushback against it has been enormous. The effort is, mostly unanimous and clear, uh, vis-a-vis the media. That this isn't supposed to happen, and I don't. I don't want to say I see the writing on the wall, but I kind of do. And I wonder where it's going to go from here. But yeah, I mean, I have friends who desperately want to see Brexit happen. And like I say, if it does, it's a foot in the door. It creates the possibility for change later on. But I just think that in many ways, the situation that Britain is in is not all that different than the one that America is in, and that is, It's the most populated and important financial centers. It's great cities are so diverse right now, and the way their electorates work, as we saw in the Canadian election, um, that's a firm grip, and non-Brits or Brits of non-European descent or of non-British Isles descent are going to ensure that this never happens.
Oh, absolutely.
Um,
Now, as much as people, including ourselves, poke fun at the French and the Swedes and any of these other groups, even the Germans, they're still not in as dire straits demographically as any country in the Anglosphere you could point to.
yeah, absolutely.
Barring Australia, I'll say that.
Yeah,
Now, speaking
yeah,
of
that's really the exception.
yeah, speaking of France, you tuned me into a little bit of news, and I'll let you take the lead on this one.
Right. So I don't know if people have noticed, but if you're scrolling on your phone through the world news from Google or what have you, you'll notice that consistently the last week or two, every day you'll find at least one or two articles about how Macron messed up in the Balkans, and we spoke about this on our last show. So he denied entry and for Albania and for North Macedonia on a path towards the EU. And of course, the articles will state that this is leaving the door open for Russia and for China. It's a little funny because, China is the biggest trading partner with almost every single EU country. Why they're so upset that would happen or increase in the Balkans more so, I don't know. What are they exactly doing about it within their own countries? So it seems a little silly and a little hypocritical. But so he's been lambasted, and even some of his own, even some other political members, like other politicians within the EU, have come out against Macron. And Macron has really kind of taken advantage of a unique situation. While Britain is preoccupied with Brexit, while Angela Merkel is basically a lame president at this point. She's going to be exiting in 2021. Her health is not in good condition. And then, of course, we have Italy and Poland and Hungary and so on. Macron has kind of taken advantage of the situation, and he's persistent, even if it doesn't make him popular, including not popular in France. So apparently, when the review came up, he dismissed it offhand. He wouldn't even look at the report about why the path to ascension toward the EU should be granted to North Macedonia and Albania. In fact, he said the process for entry is bizarre anyways, long before North Macedonia and Albania. So he's really, he's flexing right now. He's really showing a lot of criticism, like fundamental to the way the EU functions. Again, while you have Westerners claiming that they want Russia to not become completely subservient to China. This is just, this has been repeated many, many times over. At the same time, they're worried about Russia getting into the Balkans. Well, I mean, how does this work? You don't want them to partner with China. You want them integrated into the EU, but you don't want them to have more partners. They're basically implying is a very limited role in right-wing magazine or blog that's got everybody upset. I think he's being pragmatic. I think he senses the state that the EU is in. I think, yes, he's also being opportunistic. He wouldn't be the first French president who thinks that France should lead the EU in terms of policy. So while that may surprise some people, it's not uncommon for French presidents to feel that way and to even express it. So I thought I'd mention that about Macron, about the kind of things he's doing now. And I think personally, though, him denying ascension to North Macedonia and Albania underscores something very profound about like what the EU is and isn't, right. America, you could say, started off on better footing. uh, it was less diverse, and before it kept consolidating its power, centrally speaking, it went deep. It went within the 13 colonies, and it developed gradually, and so on and so on. There was a civil war, and it kept pushing in this direction gradually. What you see with the EU is an urgency to imitate the US. But it begins. Its preposition is that of a much more diverse group of people with very long periods and histories of being independent or under a different European power for centuries and so on. And this kind of, we have to gobble up every little country in Europe in order to set a bulwark against Russia is, frankly, it's ridiculous. I think Macron would be the first to recognize, the kind of corruption that still goes on, say, in Romania and Bulgaria, ever since they got accepted in 2007. So he sees, I think, that it's a weak institution. I think he sees that it's foiling right now, and that they cannot just keep adding new countries that are going to become very dependent on the EU. So I think, in a way, he's seeing kind of like a more, a potentially darker future for the EU. And so therefore he has to be more pragmatic, and he has to be more conservative.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, we discussed this in depth last week. We actually finished up the show saying, yeah, the admission of a country like Ukraine would probably be the undoing of the European Union and probably put it at critical mass, just be too much for it to handle. Now, about a year ago, I started calling Macron the neoliberal Napoleon, and I did that out of complete scorn and contempt. Now I stick to what I say, I stick to that nickname, but I do it out of a grudging respect.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think he's right now at the moment the only, I mean, not that we like any of these leaders, but at the moment it's not arguable. He's the strongest leader in Europe at the moment.
I'd say in the
And I
West,
think he
I would
recognizes
say
that.
at this point he's stronger than Trump.
Yeah, you could argue that. You could argue that. I know. I think also, um, perhaps he doesn't see that much advantage. What would the advantage be for Albania and Macedonia to be in the EU? Does it really help the EU, or does it just thwart Russia? I mean, Russia's role there kind of ebbs and wanes, and um, it's always going to be constant, especially with Slavic Orthodox countries. So that's not going to change anytime soon. And they're not going to buy into all the propaganda about Russia, anyways. So uh, I think he made a wise move, and it's kind of delicious watching all these publications upset about it. Like, this was a golden opportunity that was missed, following on the heels of Trump's withdrawal from Syria. Um, so, in a way, the left in the West also has this kind of ominous future, projecting an ominous future ahead, which is something that they always project on the right wingers.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Now, I do have a bit of alternative theory. Now, I completely agree with everything you just said, but just expound on that. I think as for motivation, beyond the fact that he just doesn't see the point or want to overload the EU, he may be denying them entry. I don't know, especially to Northern Macedonia. Maybe as a play to Greece, whose confidence in the European Union has been shaken heavily over the past 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent insight. I don't think it's a sole one, but yes, it's probably a point that he could argue that. and Greece has lost confidence in the EU. They are pessimistic, and you know, with ever more erratically within NATO, Macron might see that Greece ultimately might be uh, keeping Greece happy might be ultimately what's best for the EU with reference to Russia.
Yeah, and
So
if that's the case too, he's also pretty much uh, given up on any hope of Turkish integration into the European Union, which I think has been a lost cause for a while, but that would sort of just solidify it.
yeah, it's basically over. I mean, that's Turkey's not going to be accepted into the EU. Not probably not in our lifetime or ever.
I mean, the question is like, how much longer will this behemoth last? That we could debate that all day, but just a question I think ties really good into this. With Macron's pragmatism, with Merkel at a lame duck, with Trump really being impotent, not being able to do much, which of the first major Western countries do you think will be the first to recognize Crimea as a Russian territory? I'm going to go on a limb. Okay, now Italy would be the obvious one to say because even their left wing, even like with the more left wing coalition they have in power, they're still pretty pro Russia. They're still pretty open to cooperation with Russia. So I think it isn't really fair, and to call them a major power is also a bit of a stretch. But I think it may be Macron because okay, so France they're willing to make these overtures to Russia in order, and from a more pragmatic standpoint, Germany again with Merkel in her lame duck term, she may do it just as a last thing, like a leaving office sort of present thing, or we have to look at it this way. Germany has more invested in the whole Ukraine situation, the coup against Ukraine, than France ever did. And I would say arguably as much, if not more, than the United States ever did. So I think Germany's a bit of a long stretch. And again, I would say France will probably be the first country to recognize the annexation of Crimea.
Or based on the Nord Stream, maybe Norway. No, I doubt it. Uh, you might have something there. Macron has been pushing to include Russia in back into the G7 to turn it into the G8 again, and this is more substantive than other EU leaders and other pundits who will go on about how Russia has to be brought back into Europe, and but any kind of substantial headway that Russia makes into Europe, let's say the Balkans or Hungary, is treated as a threat. So there's no. It's kind of like the path for ascension into the EU, or when they lament that the rise of populism. Of course, neoliberalism is right. We just didn't give them the right path to follow, or we just didn't give them any other options. Well, you didn't give them any other options because you're afraid of presenting other options. And so I agree with you that like France is probably most likely. Again, Macron could be seeing a very different Europe ahead. And we've already talked about a two-tier EU anyways, and that also seems to be forming. So yeah, I mean, if he's the only EU leader, and at the moment, definitely in the last year, the most prominent EU leader pushing for Russia inclusion into the G7, then yeah, it would be him.
Yeah, like I said, countries like Italy, countries like Hungary, I don't think it's fair to say number one because they're not major powers. Number two, since they already have such a amicable relationship with the Russians compared to Western Europe, at least northwestern Europe, that I think it would have been too obvious. And I think it wouldn't necessarily fall under the major powers thing. But yeah, especially if you take the four of the U.S., U.K., France, and Germany, France is going to be the first one out of all those, especially with Macron at the helm.
Yeah, I mean, he's immensely unpopular right now, and for very different reasons, and from very different factions within France. And and it's hard to predict what will happen, but I think he will remain leader for the next few years. That's for sure. Um, so yeah, and a lot is going to depend on next year's election in America too. One of the reasons why I could never, even if Germany wasn't invested in Ukraine, I could never see Germany actually recognizing Crimea because America would be breathing down its neck. It's
Yeah, well, we actually have a story on that to close out the show, but yeah, German lawmakers are not happy with the U.S. But speaking of Ukraine and Russia and Russian integration to Europe into the West, I think something that may give them pause, not as in like pausing something, not POZ. Even though, granted, it would be both at this point. Let's not kid ourselves. Is this comes from a couple days ago. Zelensky's office launches large-scale privatization in Ukraine of 2,000 industries and 2,000 sectors. Correction, 1,000 industries and 1,000 like state-run businesses over 20 years. That of course include like major historical sites, things that are very valuable to the Ukrainian history or pseudo history, depending on who you ask. And people are saying that this is going to be another Yeltsin style sort of thing happening in Ukraine. And we were discussing off stream the fact that if Ukraine continues down the path it's going to, which it probably will, it may be beneficial to Russia in the long run as it shows this the Russian leadership. Russian people look at that and they can like say that's what the EU, that's what the West, that's what the liberals want to do to our country. They want another Yeltsin power.
right. That's an excellent point. For the Ukrainians themselves, I would wager that they are going to be upset that all their sectors are being bought out, and a lot is going to depend on what manifests afterwards. That is, if there's an uptick in the economy, then I think they will accept it. Some of them begrudgingly, some of them quite happily. But I think at the moment, the big news also in besides of course this and we covered the agricultural selling of out of Ukraine a few weeks back is the Steinmeier plan for peace in Donbass. And so in most areas there seems to be a withdrawal. There are, however, a few small towns where Ukrainian troops are not withdrawing. They're entrenched in villages that up until 2000 that in 2016 were controlled by the Donetsk militias. However, because of the Minsk II agreement, they pulled out, and of course, Ukrainians happily went into these towns.
Yeah, and another
So
big problem with that
there are some.
is the pro-government militias fighting against the separatist militias. Of course, the pro-government militias they have less control over than the regular army, so they've been stirring up a lot of trouble. Not necessarily like Azov, because Azov's, believe it or not, it's actually kind of a small group, but groups like them cause a lot more trouble.
Right, but Azov projects well beyond its small membership. There was a confrontation between Zelensky and Azov last week. So, and this was all over the news in Ukraine and in Russia. Zelensky visibly being upset, saying, "Who do you think I am? I'm a 42-year-old man. I'm the president of this nation. You're going to have to do what I say." So, the honeymoon period for Zelensky has begun to end. We're at the beginning of the end of the honeymoon season. What they will do, I don't know. There are protests already in Kiev, but my feeling is there's less of a consensus for this than there was against Yanukovych. So I don't see this going very far. There's still no sign that of any CIA funding. So I think too many Ukrainians would be divided on dismissing Zelensky so quickly.
Well, I think the bigger problem is too many Ukrainians have left the country, and too many Ukrainians have very easy means to leave the country if things get any worse.
Yeah, that there's that too, right? But for those that are going to remain, um, I think that going against Zelensky now, having another coup, who's going to orchestrate that coup? Who's going, like, are American politicians going to land in Kiev like last time and push this forward? Well, no, I don't see that happening. And in fact, I don't, it's not in America's interest or in the EU's interest, or NATO's for that matter, to poke this situation any further. I think they'll be looking for some kind of containment. Honestly, if it gets out of hand, but the popular support isn't there for to Al Zelensky to get things violent because of the border. It's been 5 years, and essentially the lines are where the lines have been for several years now, and they're not getting them back. They're not getting Crimea back. They're not getting Donbass back. Right. Um, I'm not saying Zelensky is sincere about the Steinmeier plan. I don't think he is. And I think even if he was, I think giving Donbass autonomy uh, will be, the event that maybe uh, might start the ball rolling against massive protests, the kind that we saw beginning in 2013. But over getting troops to clear out of small towns that have gone back and forth a dozen times in 5 years, no, that won't do it.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I think again it also goes back to the point where it's going to take something big like that, but at the end of the day, the ones who are pro Russia or more pro Russia will just emigrate to Russia as the process has been streamlined greatly in the past few months. And the ones who aren't will just go westward. They'll go to Poland, they'll go to Germany or France or even the United States if it gets that bad. There's so few Ukrainians that actually want to stand by their country now, and frankly, I can't blame them. And you also get in the fact that Ukraine's more of an artificial country with its a history that isn't entirely its own. You could say so. Yeah, I don't blame them. The ones who identify more with the West just running away, and the ones who identify more with Russia just running away. And I
The
think
ones that are, yeah, go ahead.
I think funny enough, what has happened since the Maidan has proven the fact that Ukraine honestly just is an artificial country. Even in countries that see this level of chaos, their people will stick by them out of an ingrained patriotism or ingrained nationalism or an ingrained loyalty to at least their family and community. But there's not that in Ukraine, and I think it just goes back
Mm-hmm.
to the fact that it isn't really a country.
Yeah, you know what? I wonder about the demographics that are streaming into Western Europe. My suspicion is these aren't people who lived on the front lines. I mean, most certainly some are. Most certainly there were people that were leaving those, the war zone of 2014 and 2015, especially 2015, like Kharkov and other areas just outside the reach of the DPR. But also, that town was held by the Donbass militias for a while. However, I think the majority that are leaving Ukraine are nowhere near the conflict zone, haven't been to the conflict zone, haven't been affected in any way directly by the conflict zone.
No, yeah,
And
they're economic migrants. It's because
yeah,
Ukraine,
they're not.
all hell is
They're yeah,
broken
they're
loose.
not right. Right. So technically, you could say Ukraine has a civil war. I'm a refugee. I'm not a migrant. But the truth is, we know where it's happening. It's in a very small corner of eastern Ukraine, and those that left for Russia were literally in war zone. Most of them, of course, there's exceptions, but yeah, that would be, I'm curious about what the numbers would be,
Yeah,
if any.
I can almost guarantee you these people are from areas like Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk, or like that part of the country.
Yeah,
Um,
as far as they're concerned, they are Europe.
the true heirs to Kiev and Rus, the true Ruthenians. uh, Ukrainian nationalists are another breed. I'd say they're actually in terms of even on Twitter at least they're up there with the Turkish nationalists. Like,
Yeah,
but
yeah, but they're more cringy than Turkish nationalists.
yeah, because yeah, Turkey at least has like a history and something. That Turkey had an empire. They're not claiming to
Yeah.
be. I mean, okay, let's not pretend like Turkey doesn't steal plenty of history, but again, they at least built something of their own at some point. Not like these
Mm.
yeah, Western Ukrainians. Funny enough, they like me. At least the ones I've met, they're not bad people, but it's like, I'm sorry, your history's fake, your country's fake, but that's beside the point. Look, I not even going to get into it. But in terms of things going Russia's way, we have more news out of this. Is Russia is to start testing new nuclear-capable missiles in 2020 and deploy them in 2021. Now, depending on the way the Democratic primaries go, depending on who's the candidate, whatever, I'm sure you'll see people talk about this. They'll talk about Russian aggression. They'll play this up. And they'll also, of course, point to Trump saying, look, you destroyed the INF treaty. This is why Russia is acting so aggressive. This is why, yeah, oh,
I know.
great job, Russian bot, Blumph. Now, um, this would have happened regardless. I can say that with just the way things are going. Now, I'm sure this accelerated this.
Of
We
course.
may have seen this a couple years later. It had the INF stayed intact, or at least stayed intact in name. But again, that's whatever. That's beside the point. It's actually been about a year since they scrapped it. 6 months since the scrapping came into effect. But that's all aside the point. Now, I'm not surprised. I think Russia, after the past few years of strangulation, I would say post Maidan, just to loop things back around, tie everything together, they're feeling more confident with their more or less victories in Syria, with Crimea seized, with the stalemate in eastern Ukraine. Now, I think they're feeling more confident because you get these kind of tests either when a country is fearing for its existence, as in the case of North Korea and some of these other types of countries, or that they have a new wind in their sails that they're ready to take on the future, which I would say is in Russia and to an extent China's case.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, I mean, this kind of destabilization process that you see happening everywhere around the West has suited Russia very well. In other news, Norway has approved of Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 is nearly complete now, and
Yeah, Denmark as well.
Orban has signed a deal as well uh, for uh, for Russian gas. Um, of course, Ukraine is furious about this, but I mean that's tremendous initiative. When you think about what actually took place with the coup or the revolution in Ukraine, that Ukraine could essentially cut off all these pipelines, and of course they were still siphoning off gas and so on, and Russia was well aware of it, but that Russia would take the initiative and, well, we're just going to build more pipelines, one in the Black Sea and one in the North Sea. And they did that, and they're managing a war in Syria, and they're managing their own domestic and economic problems. That's a lot of initiative.
And going beyond that, like I said, Turk Stream's coming along well because, according to the Hungarian foreign minister, Peter Szijjártó, I won't even try to pronounce that, is that Bulgaria is expected to open up, of course, a new delivery route to Hungary. So that's coming along well. And
Mhm.
uh, yeah, I honestly, there's no other way to paint this than if you would have told me this again after the Maidan, I would have thought, yeah, okay, what are you talking about? And this is also coming on the heels of the contract between Russia and Ukraine expires come the new year. In terms of
Mhm.
the gas and the pipeline. So they've not only found one, but two ways to circumvent them, one going under them and one going above them. So, of course, these have
All
been
right.
in the works for years. And uh, yeah, and you could tell, of course, Germany was in on Nord Stream 2, whatever. The United States, Trump's initial pushback against this has all but evaporated. You recall 2017, 2018. One of his biggest things against Russia, even when he was being more conciliatory towards them, was you got to stop selling gas to Europe. That's our market. And he's almost, I would say he's entirely given up on that talking point. Now, I don't know whether he pushed on that because he wanted to or because John Bolton or Mike Pompeo told him to, but uh, yeah. Things on the, just a side note, things on American foreign policy have been a lot quieter since John Bolton has left about a month and a half ago. So really no surprise, but I do yeah I just find it fascinating the fact that Russia has they've they looked like they were about to be checkmated and they just flipped the board. Now I wouldn't say
I
Russia's in
know.
a position of like final victory of they're going to be the next they're going to have world hegemony for the next 400 years or whatever, but it's impressive considering the fact that a country that looked like it was on death's doorstep in 1991, just 30 years later, less than 30 years later, is right here.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you can see this a similar process is taking place in the West that was taking place in the late 70s and the 80s in the Soviet Union. Um, and then, frankly, it's only going to get more difficult. There's going to be even less internal cohesion. In many ways, the problems in the West are even bigger than they were, like on a cultural level, or bigger than they were in Russia. The Soviet Union's problems was mostly economic, but that's no less important, I suppose.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, even after the Soviet Union, after 70 years, completely turned Russian and the cultures of whatever country occupied on its head, they still have a cohesive culture that's identifiable with what they had in the 20th century, in the 19th century, as opposed to you bring an American from 1910 into the future, and hypothetically, you show them it today, they're not going to recognize it. Now, you take a Russian from the same time period, show him his country today. Look, a lot of things will be different, but he'll still recognize, like, yes, it's the country I know.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. That's what I meant about the difficulties ahead. If not for the grace of economic plenitude, things would be very different. Um, yeah, and like the other thing worthy of mentioning is, I don't know if another Russian leader could have managed what what Putin has. Um, what Putin has done ultimately for Russia is going to be remembered, and I think will be actually remembered on a scale similar to Stalin.
Yeah,
Uh, for vastly different reasons. The death rate in the 90s exceeded that of Ivan the Terrible's reign. So it was a very, very bad 10 years that can't be understated.
I mean, you got to look
But
at
yeah,
this. Yeah, you got to look at the situation. Of course, Yeltsin was the bumbling drunk. We all know the stories. We all seen the video clips. If you got somebody who was more hawkish, who was more of a Russian nationalist than Putin, they would have started another Cold War, which would have driven Russia into the ground yet another time. If you would have gotten another Yeltsin who succeeded him, Russia would be like
mm-hmm.
Ukraine is today. If you didn't have that perfect balance of, or near perfect balance of,
Talk about it.
yeah,
Yeah,
near perfect balance
yeah,
of like
absolutely.
uh, conciliatory relations with the West, while maintaining a degree of Russian nationalism, a degree of putting your own nation first, it would have fallen apart.
Yeah, you know, we often talk about how Putin recognizes what Russia's weaknesses are, but I think he also recognizes the weaknesses of both the U.S. and the EU too, and I think that's informed him in his decision making.
Yeah, I would say so too. Now I have one last story to close this out with. So, Bundestag lawmakers in Germany want U.S. troops and nukes out of the country. Now, these are lawmakers from Die Link Party, which is the left-wing opposition in Germany, and they're calling for a complete removal of all nuclear weapons and all 35,000 U.S. personnel from the country, citing specifically tensions with Russia being the reason they want them out. Now, this follows about, I think, a year and a half ago with ADF lawmakers coming out and saying almost exactly the same thing. You can see in a lot of these countries that there's a bipartisan or multi-partisan support for a more conciliatory relationship with Russia or less ties to the United States or playing less of a role in the new Cold War, quote unquote. So I just thought that was worth bringing up. Of course, this was a parliamentary motion from earlier this month, last month in October, and it didn't get very far. But I think considering the fact that it's the second time we've seen it within a period of a year or so, I think it's something else, and I think it's telling of the time to come, especially again as we were discussing the Nord Stream pipeline, as we were discussing all these things, faltering American power, the shift in Europe, that we're going to see more of this. We're going to see uh, co-sponsored ADF link bills possibly denouncing American presence or some American aggressive move in Europe or hell even the Middle East at this point. Now, unfortunately for these last couple minutes here, GSP had to leave the call. He had some things to take care of, and I just think it's insane that we're here where we are. But from everything to the Middle East to what's happening in Europe, I again I'm at a loss for words. And keep in mind, keep in mind that it's November 1st as I'm recording this. Will be November 2nd as you're watching this, at least on the premiere date. That we are 2 months out from the end, not only of this year, of this decade. Compare that again. I know I always pointed the 1990s, the height of American power. Compare that to 2009, 2010, the early Obama years. Look at how much has changed since then. Look at how much has changed since 2000, since the Bush years, in which we've been meaning to do a stream on the Bush Obama years, similar to the one we did on the Bush Clinton years.